Okay, I am recording.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, welcome to lecture 3 of Introduction to the Natural World. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the Teanaway and Blewett Pass area. And then Stuart's going to take over from there. He is going to talk about geology and butterflies. But there's a little housekeeping to do first. So far we've got 2 field trips posted, one to Iron Bear and one to the Swamp Forest Discovery Trail. There will be more to come. Bruce and Stuart have both said they'll lead weekend field trips in the Teanaway, but there's so much lingering snow. They need to scout the routes in the Teanaway before posting. So there's still a lot of snow there. And for this round, there's also an option for people to do virtual field trips, and you can find that in the after lecture homework under lecture 3 in the Google Classroom. I am not going to talk a lot about geology tonight, just a slide or two, because Stuart's going to cover that. And then usually in lecture 3, we do a hands-on exercise with tree cuttings from the east side of the Cascades and a hands-on butterfly ID activity. But because we're on Zoom this year, we can't pass around tree cuttings, unfortunately, but we have put a tree ID slideshow on the Google Classroom, along with 1 for flowering shrubs and 3 for flowering plants. So there'll be good practice there for you to do. And then there's also a much longer version of this slideshow that I gave in 2019, and that is up on the website, and it has a lot more flowers in it. And there is something in there about a competition, but that was a competition for 2019, so I don't have any cookies to give away tonight, sorry. So, but you can do the competition if you want. There's just no prizes this year. And do any students have any questions before we get going about the field trips or anything? Okay, you can always put them in the Google Classroom if you think about them later on. So many thanks to our field trip 2 leaders, especially Maureen and Barbara Fulmer who led 2, and Vicki King who led 3. Woo! All right, Cindy Luskus put this slideshow together originally. This is a classic picture of the Teanaway area. Unfortunately, you can see some of the trees are not so healthy. So in the Teanaway, the area's climate features warm, dry summers and cold, wet winters. And you'll find a mix of sedimentary sandstone deposits, volcanic basalts, metamorphic rocks, and glacial and river deposits. So the area is home to a wide variety of fish and wildlife. The forest provides habitats ranging from a dry pine-based lowland forest to a wet, high elevation ground fir-based environment. Elk and mule deer live in the area year-round, and the forest includes important wintering and calving grounds. Other species such as cougars, black bears, spotted owls, and one of the state's gray wolf packs also live in the forest. So this is what we'll cover a little bit in our natural history overview. All right, so a little bit of the history of the Teanaway. It was part of the summering grounds for a number of tribes, including Yakima, Cayuse, and Nez Perce. The watershed is within the ceded area of the Yakima Nation under the Treaty of 1855. So in addition to the water rights to the area being controlled by Eastside farmers, a lot of this is involved in a federal treaty. So the Teanaway was part of the summering grounds for these native groups, and the name Teanaway possibly had its origins in the Sahaptin word Teanawafnafens, which means drying place. So today, recreation is one of the biggest uses of the area, although there is still ranching and in the form of what are called ranchettes, smaller ranches. Most timberlands are now owned by the public. So sheep and livestock grazing occurred before the timber industry. with several 100,000 head of livestock raised in the area. Timber harvest began early in the 1900s, and this photo is of loading logs onto railroad cars in Upper Kittitas County in the town of Teanaway in 1930. So where are we going? You can see from this map on the west side in the center is Snoqualmie Pass. Let's see if you can see is my pointer showing? And so this is the area that we'll be in. Here's the Teanaway over here, and the Teanaway Community Forest is down here. And then over here in Blewett Pass is where the Swamp Forest Trail will be. So the Teanaway Community Forest is relatively new. It's a over 50,000 acre landscape lying at the headwaters of the Yakima Basin. The state purchased this land in 2013 and established Washington's first state-owned community forest. And in this forest, there are about 400 miles of free-flowing streams and prime habitat for fish and wildlife. So here is the Bean Creek area and the Bean Basin, which is a really popular spot. Hopefully the snow will melt out enough so that we can have a field trip there this year. So Mount Stewart really does dominate the views here. It's really, really impressive. So the wonderful thing about the Teanaway is we've got alpine settings with alpine meadows. There's just great hiking, climbing, scrambling, skiing, and the wintertime snowmobiling. There are some off-road vehicles and motorcycle trails here, as well as camping and horseback riding. So these are the summits in this picture of Bean and Earl Peaks. When we do go to the Bean Creek Basin, we stay in the basin and we don't go up to those summits. But while you're there, keep an eye out for seeps and other wet areas. This is one of my favorite plants to see along the trail, the bog orchid. And the hillsides are dotted with paintbrush. And also look for butterflies at the Bean Creek crossing. That's a favorite spot for them. Esmeralda Basin is another trip that we take with not quite as much elevation. And it shows some of the lovely, lovely meadows in the Teanaway. By the time we get there, glacier lilies will probably be past, but it should be a great time to see some of these shooting stars. So Squawk and Tronson Ridge are on the east side of Blewett Pass and Highway 97. They're a little bit easier to get to than the Teanaway. The Squawk Forest Discovery Trail is our easiest hiking option, and Tom and I will be taking a trip there this year. And this area was burned over, so it's got some interesting things to see because of that. We won't be able to offer a Tronson Ridge trip this year because there was a road washout on the higher southern approach. But look for it next year as another naturalist trip. And one of the great things to see here is the pretty rare Tweedy's Lewissia, which reminds me a little bit of an opal. It's sort of pink and sort of pale green and sort of white and sort of yellow. Iron Peak is another one. I'm not sure if it's going to be offered this year, but you get a great workout on Iron Peak. WTA says the switchbacks are short when they're there and much of the tread is rocky. What's interesting about Iron Peak is that it travels through the El Dorado Research Natural Area, which is a parcel of land that was set aside in 1972 to protect several species of plants and wildlife that thrive thanks to the unique geology here. So there's a signature green serpentine, swapped sandstone, and peridotite. And so this is one of my favorite little flowers, the spotted saxifrage. It looks beautiful if you magnify it. Cheryl's going to lead a trip to Iron Bear, and Washington Native Plant Society field trip said the best parts of this hike are where the forest opens up to steep meadows and rock outcroppings that support a spectacular diversity of plants. So you might see the Wenatchee Mountain Lumation, which is endemic to this area, Skyrocket or Scarlet Helia, and then the Steer's Head, which is actually a pretty small plant. It's if you're lucky, you'll see it near the summit. And Iron Bear, I think the name comes from, it's between the convergence of the Iron Creek and Bear Creek. So for more on the flowering plants and shrubs, you can see the Google Classroom for the 4 slideshows that I mentioned earlier. Some of my favorites are here are the bracted wellswort on the left. On the bottom is Pearly Everlasting. And then on the top right is Pipsissewa. And I think they're just my favorites because I like the names. So here's a little bit about geology. I'm not going to get too much into this, but just so you know that these are here. This area is the late Jurassic. And some of the really neat things here are serpentinite and serpentinized peridotite. And we've got volcanic and intrusive igneous rocks. So hopefully some of you watched the video ahead of time on Mount Stewart, and maybe you have an answer to how did those mountains get there? So did it come from Washington State or from around Baja? All right, so here's some of the special things. This is on Ingles Peak. You can see these climbers here, and there's some serpentinite, which is very, very, very slippery rock, especially when it's wet. So be careful, don't step on the green rock if you're near the edge. So some people refer to the areas around the Teanaway as looking like moonscape. So this is the ridge between Freedom and Navajo Peaks. It really does look like a moon with a few trees and a little bit of snow. All right, so moving on to trees. Here's a little bit of a tree quiz. And we're going to be using our conifer chart. So right here, we have 2 different trees. On the left, we have clusters of 3 needles with an egg-shaped cone. And on the right, we have clusters of 5 needles with a long, narrow cone. So going to our trusty chart, we can see that both of these species grow on the east side of the Cascades, below 4,500 or 5,000 feet. And so the one on the left is the ponderosa pine, and then the one on the right is the western white pine. All right, so another quiz here. Cones with bracts, with a bottle brush look to the branches. I think we've seen that tree on the left somewhere before in this class. And then the hint for the tree on the right is it has horizontal needles that are mixed, long and short, flat needles. Does anybody want to guess in the chat what the one on the left is? If nobody guesses this, Tom Stewart and I are going to feel really badly. We're going to have to start teaching over again. No guesses. Do you know what it is, Andrew?
It's the one with bracts.
It's the one with bracts.
A whole bunch of Douglas firs.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes. Yep. When in doubt, guess Douglas fir. All right, so that's a Douglas fir on the left with our bottle brush and the cones with the 3-point bracts. And then on the right is the grand fir. And so both of these trees grow on the east and the west side of the Cascades. So they're a little bit trickier. They are also below 4,500 or 500 feet, 5,000 feet, sorry. All right, so there's our grand fir and our Douglas fir. All right. So can anyone guess what this tree is after our little review? It's a little bit hard to see the needles, but if you look at the bark, do we have any guesses there for the bark of what this tree is? What's your guess, Andrew? Andrew should have a good guess because he grew up in one of these forests.
Yep.
Yes.
I see the answers.
It's a ponderosa pine, yes. Yep. All right, this was me being really lazy one day, taking a nap on the side of a trail. You can look at the bark a little bit, look at the size of the tree, look at the forest that it's in. Anyone have any guesses on that one? It's 90% of the trees here. Yep, that's our Douglas fir. This is on the, this used to be on the Margaret's Way Trail. It was a good napping spot, but it's moved now. So someone took it down. All right, so here are a few more of the trees that we're gonna see. So there's the mountain hemlock on the left and the Engelmann spruce on the right. And we'll see lots more lodgepole pines, alpine firs, white bark pines, Pacific yews, silver firs, and western larches. All right, name that tree or name that mountaineer. I'm going to give you a hint. This is a tree that's growing above 5,000 feet. John Bell climbed a mountain to get us this specimen for our 2019 class. You have any hints on that?
Lugged it all the way back too.
All right. It's over 5,000 feet and it can be dwarfed or twisted. All right. So that was the white bark pine. And Tom's going to talk a little bit more about the white bark pine when we do our Rainier presentation. All right. So this is a early or late spring, early summer picture of this tree. This is our one tree that is going to drop its needles that we're going to see. Yes, larches. And it's hard to tell from this picture what type of a larch this is. But make sure that you go back to the Teanaway in the fall to see the larches turn. There are two types of larches here in Washington. The alpine grow above 5,000 feet and are much smaller than western larches, which grow between 3,000 and 5,000 feet in elevation. So, especially in the Teanaway, you can see that our forests are struggling a little bit. Years of logging out the older trees, accumulation of dead wood, and fire suppression management have resulted in more shade-tolerant trees, such as the Douglas fir and grand fir, filling in the open spaces that pre-settlement forests used to have. So now we have a mature climax or late successional forest that is tending more towards a monoculture. On the east side of Blewett Pass, you can really see this. The Table Mountain burned over 40,000 acres. And it just kept burning until it got rained out. So the lodgepole pine is a fire-dependent species, and it does require fires to maintain healthy populations. With the heat of the fire opening the cones to seeds. So excessive wildlife prevention disrupts the fire ecology. So, so the stands are usually so densely populated that the trees self-thin or outcompete each other, leaving dead trees standing. And then these become fuel for the fires and accelerate the fire to the crown of living trees. So when we get crown fires, then the fires become relatively unstoppable. So the natural fire regime for this species is primarily driven by climate. And they experience a lot of moisture in the summer, in snow, but because of the density of these stands, the fires are almost burning too hot now. So this is an older lodgepole pine that escaped a fire, and you can see the ones in the background were not quite as fortunate. So when the fires do burn too hot, the land can the earth can almost become sterilized, making it difficult for things to grow out of there. So we'll probably see this more and more with climate change, unfortunately. Hopefully, there'll be more money to manage our forests rather than just fight the fires. So in addition to trees, there's also some pretty fun ferns in the Teanaway. So make sure to look up in the rock faces and in between rocks on talus slopes for ferns that are seeking seeps and wet spots or shade. So here's a Shasta fern. This is a parsley fern growing in some rocks. And this is an Indian dream fern here. like there's maybe some lilies growing around there as well. So the Teanaway has some great birding. You'll see some familiar ones like we have here, dark-eyed juncos. The western tanagers are pretty beautiful and pretty stunning, evening grosbeaks. So make sure don't forget your binoculars. Other birds are olive-sided flycatcher, Clark's nutcracker, Townsend's warbler, more of those lazuli buntings, and mountain chickadees. There are lots and lots of butterflies in the Teanaway. So here's some of them. You'll see, and if you, Stuart will talk about his butterfly charts too. But it's fun to say things like fritillary and checker spot. Stuart recommends this pocket guide to butterflies of Washington State, if anybody wanted to buy one. This one is a little less than $20. So this is a picture of Stuart and his native habitat butterflying in the Bean Creek Basin. And so the butterfly charts are in the Google Classroom. That's also a great place to see lichen, especially these two lichens are really brilliant on trees. So it's a wolf lichen and a brown-eyed wolf lichen. And this is a witch's hair lichen, and I did put the lichen charts up in the Google Classroom today as well. And I know some people in the class have already taken it, but if you haven't, keep an eye out for Stuart and Gary's moss and lichen course in the wintertime. So Wolfpack established itself in the Teanaway in 2015. There's also some good fishing, spring chinook, steelhead, and bull trout, but they are federally protected in this watershed. And then you know, it's a good place to see some animals. Most likely you'll see chipmunks, squirrels, and marmots than these bigger species, but you might get lucky and see a mountain goat or some elk. All right, that's the end of my overview of the Teanaway. And we'll move on to Stuart next.
Okay. Can you all hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is talk first about butterflies and then a little bit about the geology of Washington. My philosophy in teaching is to show you more how to learn butterflies.
Stuart, could you hold on just a second?
Sure.
It says that the recording is paused. Did you pause the recording, Tom?
No, mine says recording.
Okay, great. Go for it then.
Okay. So what I want to do, that's why I do charts. And that's why we don't go through each individual bird or I mean, excuse me, plant or moss or butterfly, but how to use the chart. Because I think you probably, if it's like me, you just don't remember more than about 5 things that you're shown. So anyway, let's get started first with butterflies, just because they're a little bit more whimsical and geology is a little bit more serious. So let me get started here. I practiced, so I think I'll be able to do this correctly now.
Yep, there you go.
All right. Okay, so we're going to talk about insects and butterflies, but pretty much just butterflies with a little bit of reference to insects as it applies to butterflies rather than the reverse. And this is an adaptation of Maureen Traxler's presentation she did about 3 years ago. She's a much better, knows butterflies much better than I have. In fact, I checked my chart with her. I tend to develop these charts and then let people who are much better at that particular piece of natural science help me make it a little bit more scientific. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the natural history. We're only going to do this for 20 minutes. I'm timing myself right now. And then we're going to look at the butterfly chart, and then we're going to practice with the chart by some pictures of butterflies that I'll show you. So let's get started. First of all, like insects, butterflies have a chitinous exoskeleton, which means they're just gooey on the inside. They don't have bones, and the muscles are not attached to the bones. They're attached to that chitinous exoskeleton. And the body is divided into head, thorax, and abdomen. But the part that interests me most is the thorax, and you'll see why as we talk about butterflies. The legs are attached to the thorax, the wings are attached to the thorax, the muscles on the inside of the body are attached to the thorax that move those appendages. And we'll see that in a few minutes. These are not insects. Ticks are not insects, are not insects, thank God. Neither are spiders. These all are insects. And you can, oops. These are butterflies, obviously, but so these are all classes, okay? So it goes class, order, family, genus, species. But within the classes of insects, they are named, the last 5 letters have to do with, relate to the wings. So like a fly is diptera, meaning 2 wings. Hemiptera, leafhoppers, means half a wing. Half of it is kind of a skeleton. For butterflies, it means they have scale wings. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at it under a microscope, they actually, the wings, they are scales if you looked at it under a microscope. So butterflies mean scale wings. And in fact, these scales can easily rub off, and the butterfly will look very different toward the end of their life because a lot of those scales will have fallen off. If you see a butterfly in its youth, oops. It's going crazy here. The top is oftentimes very colorful. In fact, just vibrant. This is a blue morpho butterfly, I believe, from the tropics. We don't have them around here. The underside of the same butterfly has pigments. Now, by pigments, I mean like keratin is yellow, and chlorophyll is green, and other things are pigments, but not so for the tops of a lot of the butterflies. If you looked at it under a microscope, you would see that the structure is what causes the color. So here is these individual scales. Now, if I really get down and look at these individual little bumps, this is what it looks like. So light comes in and is diffracted, and the wavelengths are interfered with. And it's either, these wavelengths are either intensified or reflected or canceled out. And if they magnify each other, the wavelengths, then you'll get these brilliant iridescent colors. So it's a structural color. It's not a pigment color, which I find just fascinating. Anyway, to leave the wings, they do have antennae, and that's what they touch and smell with. They have compound eyes, and the mouth part is here for siphoning. So never be afraid to let a butterfly land on you, because he can only siphon you to death. They don't bite like these guys. Again, they are in 3 segments. There's 2 pair of wings, and they're on the 2nd and 3rd segment of the thorax. And then one of the legs is attached to each part of the thorax. The abdomen, just for insects, they're really varied. I don't really have anything more to say about the abdomen. They don't really interest me very much. Life cycles, if you see a grasshopper, that's incomplete metamorphosis, because they lay an egg and then they just have a little nymph, and then they molt 5 times before the adult forms. They just increase in size. But for butterflies, they have the eggs, but they go to larva, and as you know, they go to a pupa, and then they turn to mush on the inside of that chrysalis or pupa, and then they become a butterfly. These are obviously not butterflies. Now let's just talk about butterflies. Here is, remember I said they had 5 nymphs? Well, here, if the leg, this is, as soon as the egg hatches, you have 5 instars, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the skin is not very flexible. So they have to shed it. And then a bigger butterfly comes out of that. And here's an indication of the time. You can come back and look at these. I don't have time to go through the details, but average lifespan is about 2 weeks. But mourning cloaks and monarchs, as you probably know, have much longer life cycle. When I was in the tropics, when you go to the tropics, there's all kinds of, they farm these chrysalis and then they send them all over the world. But they'll have little nature centers too, so that you can watch these caterpillars form their chrysalis. When I was watching them, these are kind of protein. Moths have silk. You can see them when they dry, they just immediately change form, just like a wave sweeping across the chrysalis. It's just amazing. And then you can go on and watch them. It takes about 15 minutes when they come out of their chrysalis to pump up their feathers before they go into flight. It's just amazing. Now the eggs, all kinds of different patterns and shapes. And here's some pictures of the different patterns. Here's swallowtails, which you may have seen. Here's whites, which fly all over your garden right now. Here's a white. And there's the egg right there, really small. So as I said, the skin is limited elasticity. So they have these instars, and most have 5 instars, but I'm repeating myself. So here is the different larvae. They're all just amazing, but it's really hard to find them. I've never really found eggs and very few larvae except for this white here, which are everywhere. Here's the 5 instars right here. They get bigger and bigger until they form their chrysalis. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So here's the pupa or chrysalis, same thing. And it's, as I said, made out of protein, and the cocoon is spun out of silk for moths. And here's different forms of the chrysalis. Just, if you go out of the tropics and see these things, it's just amazing. And then they package them up. And if you go to some of these places, they'll have these big outdoor, huge fenced in areas, and they'll have a place for the upland and a place for the lowland butterflies. And they have specific plants where they lay their eggs. They only lay their eggs on specific plants. Just another picture of a butterfly emerging from the chrysalis. As I said, they're very selective for the larvae where they lay their eggs, but when they're adults, they'll go to most any plant for nectar. Okay, so the next 4 slides, just really quickly, are going to show you the difference between a moth and a butterfly. So time of day, most of you recognize or think of moths as occurring at night, but there are ones that occur during the day. And also there's moths that can be very colorful. When we were in the tropics, Tom led a trip down to Panama, and we were actually birding way up in the mountains. But in the morning, they had these lights that collected moths all night long. We saw some of the most amazing moths you ever saw. They put butterflies to shame. So I don't know moths at all, but around here, they're not so magnificent, but down in the tropics, they're amazing. Okay, continuing with butterfly or moth. Butterflies, their wings are up, rest up. They do bask in the sun, and moths sort of form this V shape, which butterflies are not physiologically capable of. So that's pretty easy. Butterflies have a knob at the end of their antenna. Moths either feathery or pointed. So look for the knob, because it could be just pointed, and that would be a moth. And this is important to how you put a moth or a butterfly in a jar. When a butterfly is disturbed, it flies upward. When a moth is disturbed, it flies downward and will disappear into the foliage. And I'll tell you how to net a butterfly really quickly in a minute, but keep this in mind. Now, how do they flap their wings? Remember, they're just goo on the inside. There's no skeleton. The muscles are attached to that thorax, the outer portion of the thorax. So look at this. These are two wings. It's kind of hard to see here. So if you push down, there's a little Nerf ball. If you push down, the wings, which were like this, pop up. And then if these muscles that are attached here relax and the muscles down here pull and elongate the body this way, then the wing flaps down. So what they're doing is they're not applying the muscles to any structure of the wing, but to the structure or the outer exoskeleton of the abdomen. Pretty cool. And also, what's always occurred to me is that butterflies have an awfully large set of wings for the size of their body. So what I did a couple of days ago was just do an experiment. I just kind of roughly measured the size of the body. And this is the actual size of an eagle wing. But if it was proportionate to a butterfly, it would be about this big. Just to give you an idea. So why the heck do they have such big wings? It seems kind of stupid. And in fact, if I cut this butterfly's wing in half, he could still fly perfectly well. So why do they have such big ones? Well, it's like a rudder on a boat. If you have a huge rudder and you turn it 5 degrees, you're going to get a response to the boat right away. And that's what a butterfly is looking for, because they have, try to catch a butterfly in flight. It's impossible. Whereas a bird, if it was to simulate a human, he would just be walking casually down the street in a straight line. But a butterfly would take one step, skip, take a backflip, jerk right, jerk left, and then go ahead again. And you can do that because of those big wings. It helps them to maneuver really quickly. Also, the way they clap them together when they come up, it forms it's like a jet propulsion pocket. So that's why if you ever try to catch a butterfly with your hand on a plant, they just boom, disappear. And that's because of that jet propulsion pocket of slapping together. Anyway, this just shows it here that you get this sort of figure eight. And so you get this, this tornado effect on the wings, which allows them to do all kinds of movement. Whereas a wing of a bird, it's physics just allows them to have lift and they fly in a straight line and pretty easy to catch if you were a falcon. How to net it. The only thing I'll tell you is when you run after a butterfly and you scoop them up, then what you do is you just kind of hold your hand around the middle of the net to hold them down there. And then you reach your jar down, you hold your net so the top is up and the net portion is down. And you reach the jar down and then open up your hand and kind of jiggle the bottom of the net and the butterfly flies right up into your jar. It's really interesting. I once watched a lecture where this guy didn't know much about butterflies and he had it just backwards where he was trying to get them to fall into the jar, and that will never work. Okay, where do you find them? Well, early in the spring, go to Eastern Washington. Later on, June to August, go into the Cascades. They're abundant for about 6 months a year. So you can go looking at butterflies in different places for quite a while. Okay, now, identification of butterflies. Again, here's the chart.
Okay, Stuart, we have one question for you. Could you redefine what an instar is or explain what an instar is a little bit more?
Oh, okay. Actually, why don't I just quickly back up. Where was that? Okay, so these are nymphs. They call them nymphs. The instar of a butterfly is just as it goes from here to here to here to here to here. So those are the instars. I hope that answers it.
So they're the different size caterpillars as it grows from hatching to the egg to be getting ready to go to become the pupa.
Yeah, because the skin is not flexible. And so as they get bigger, they must shed that skin and go into sort of a new skin and larger. Otherwise, if their outer skeleton was flexible, they could just enlarge until it was time to form a chrysalis. So you see what I mean? So it's actually 5 sheddings of their skin. I hope that made it clear. Okay. So what I'm going to do is this chart actually works. To my surprise, when I created this, I went out butterflying, and this worked really well. But it worked really well only because I'm happy knowing that this is a swallowtail. I don't know which swallowtail it is, but I was just ecstatic to know that it's one of the 5 or 8 swallowtails. So what it did is I said, okay, what we're going to do is, first of all, pick the most common. So these reflect the most common ones you're going to see in Washington. And these bold underlined names are the group. Now I say group because that could be a subfamily, it could be a genus, it could be whatever. It's quite confusing. That's the thing that took me the longest, is just that. And finally, I just decided group, okay? I can tell you this is subfamily. Let me back up. There's only 5 families of butterflies in Washington. I have 4 here. These are called the true butterflies. The other family is, can't remember the name right now, damn. That is not a true butterfly, and I don't cover him. They pretty much disappear into the foliage, into the ground, and you hardly ever see them. I can't remember the name. Anyway, so these 2, we have 4 families here. In fact, there's only 5 families of butterflies worldwide. So you tonight have the capability to learn every butterfly in the world if you're happy with families. Anyway, so this are swallowtails and relatives, whites and sulfurs, gossamer wings, and brushfoots. I can't see the top of my slide, which just doesn't matter. So these are the groups. So the bold underline are the groups. And then if it has a smiley face on it, then that is a general group. But it means that once the butterfly lands, or if it flies slowly, then you can tell what species it is, not from this chart, but from a book I'll show you in a minute, which Daniel referred to already. And so this one, this one, this one, and this one, when they land, you could identify the species using a book, not this chart, because this chart only identifies general groups, okay? If it has a heart next to it, that is a species, a very common species. In fact, so common that I wanted to point it out so that you don't have to go to general group. In other words, you'll see morning cloak every time you go out. It's a tortoise shell, but the name is morning cloak. So it's a morning cloak, which is part of the general group tortoise shell. I hope that makes sense, because there's 2. There's millbirds and morning cloak. You'll see these really often. You see whites everywhere. When you go to Eastern Washington or up in the Cascades, you'll see these everywhere, and you could tell them because they have this orange on the top. Okay, but we're not trying to learn species. If it has a little symbol of a book, that means you can identify the general group, because you see these little blues when you go hiking next to little puddles of mud. They're collecting minerals for their mate, actually, but we won't get into that. But you can tell it's a blue, but you have to go to a book in order to find out what species it is. Even if it lights and you watch it, look at it for an hour, you won't be able to tell. Part of the reason is, like for whites, see this white? Usually they're just white on top. You have to look underneath in order to tell the species. So you have to go to a book, and that's why I put the book there. See anything else? Okay, so it's a 2-step process. So first find the group. And if you're happy with that, like look at these angle wings. You can always tell what they are because it looks like the edge of the wings have been chewed out. I used to call them angel wings just because it looks more like an angel wing to me. But anyway, all angle wings look like this. It's just the pattern, the color and the pattern on the wings that are different. But look also at the purple words under, and that'll help explain the group, not the species. So for example, fritillary have white spots under the wing, but checker spots have white spots on the top and the bottom. That's how I always tell the difference. Checker spots are a little bit, well, noticeably smaller too. I think that's all I want to say on that. Now, here's the books. And so it is this book and this book that I wanted to mention. This is the pocket guide that is really wonderful. It's 42 pages. You could slip it into your back pocket if you want. This one is quite a few pages. Mine is blocked out. I think it's like 400 pages or something like that. But the problem is I was up a couple days ago and I did not know this butterfly, and I had forgotten to put it on my chart. So I didn't even know the general group. And when I look in this little small pamphlet, it's so small, I couldn't really it took us a half hour to find it in her book. But if you knew the general group, the book can help you a little bit more because the pictures are a little bit more telling. And also it gives a geographic location. So take your pick. If you know the group, this book is really good for the bigger butterflies like the swallowtails, and because they're big pictures. But because the butterfly is small, she's chosen to make the picture small. Anyway, that's my little gripe about the pamphlet, because I really like the pamphlets, but it's got a little bit of problem in its use. Okay, this next three slides are just, if you could look at them on your own, this just talks about the club, the Butterfly Club in Washington. This talks about resources for butterflies in general in America. And this talks about insects. So butterflies, insects, and the Butterfly Club. Okay, so we're only going to be able to spend maybe, I hope it's okay to spend about 5 minutes on this. Danielle, if you don't think so, let me know. So what I'm going to do, I hope you all brought access to the chart. Because what we're going to do is just see how fast you can find it on the chart, okay? I want to point out one more thing on this. Okay, so when you're going to look at these pictures, remember these two are easy to tell in their pattern. These are uniform in their pattern in that they're all white or all sulfur color. These are pretty uniform as well, all blue, kind of bluish. But when you get into these, the brushfoots, I call it a sophisticated coloring. So look, and they're all medium to large size. These are all small. These are all medium. These are all large. These are medium to large. Okay, so color of pattern, sophisticated, and really fun to look at. It's like this. This is more like an impressionist painting. Angle wing, you can't miss anyway. Look for the white spots here. And these color patterns are really striking. Okay, now to the exercise. Okay, I'm just going to give you a minute because I can't ask for raised hands or anything. So look at the pattern, look at the size. This is actually, I'll just tell you, it's a little bit large. It is large, I mean. So I'm just going to flip it over now. So this is a swallowtail. It's a Western tiger swallowtail, but the place I want to go right now is swallowtail. Okay, next one. This is a medium-sized one, uniform color. This is easy, so I won't dwell on this one. This is white. In fact, it's a cabbage white. You can actually tell it. These dark on the edge of the wings, it helps identify it. But remember, you might have to catch this one and look under the wings for the pattern to get the species. Not so for the first one. This one's really small and it's solid blue color. So that one's pretty easy. I hope you have found that one really quick. That one's a blue. Remember, that's the general group. I haven't identified the species. You'd have to, this is even more difficult than the whites. It's really hard to distinguish these, even looking at it inside of a jar. Okay, this one, I'll tell you, it's just slightly smaller than the swallowtail, so it's a pretty large one. Let you toy with this. To me, this is not what I call a sophisticated patterns of different kinds of oranges and blacks and vivid colors. So I would be looking on the left side rather than the right side. That's why I put all the brush foots on one page, because they're so different in their striking color patterns. So this is a Parnassian. There's only 2 species of this one, so it's pretty easy. And I'm going to be leading a field trip to where this is just everywhere. So look for one of my field trips. I think it's in about 3 or 4 weeks. We're going up, I think it's the Swak Mountain, which is just amazing for butterflies. Okay, look at this one. You might suspect that this has maybe what I would call that sophisticated color pattern, not uniform. And it's kind of, I'll tell you, because you can't tell the size here, it's medium tending toward large. So maybe you all noticed the bites taken off the edges of the wings. That's angle wing. In fact, it's a satire, angle wing. And those you still have to look at a book in order to identify. This one, I would suspect again, this one is a large. It's as big as the Parnassian, slightly smaller than the swallowtail, but it's got spots, white spots. And it's only got white spots on the underside, which makes it a fritillary as opposed to a checker spot, which is smaller anyway. So now let's look at a butterfly, sophisticated coloring and white spots on the top and the bottom. So of course that would be the checker spot. See, so what you can do, what you're starting to be able to do with the help of chart is to be able to, and these are the ones you're going to see all the time when you go out in the woods. And if you use a chart, or if you can remember, I don't have as good a memory as some, you can start identifying these right away. So here's another one. I would say sophisticated coloring. So immediately I'd think brushfoot, and it's large. So this is Lorquin's admiral. Okay. The group is admiral and the species Lorquin. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there because, well, one more, just because I wanted to go to this one. The coloring, I wanted to show you this one because the light is hitting this a little bit differently than is illustrated on the chart. And you now know why, because it's not a pigment different. It's the way the light is hitting the structural elements on the top of the wing, which refract and deflect light, which cause it to become more or less iridescent in different lights. Okay. And that is morning cloak, which is really, really, really common. You'll see this guy a lot, almost every time. Okay, so I'm going to now switch over, put on my geology hat, see if I can remember how to do this. Butterfly, okay. I practiced because of last time. Okay. Geology. Okay. Okay. So my approach to geology is to teach you a little bit of practical theory, just enough to understand the fun stuff. And the fun stuff to me is to be able to look around Washington, and we're only going to talk about Washington, and to think, how did that get there? What is the process going on right now? How can I understand this as I hike, just for the fun of it? Okay. So this geology was my first love. That's actually what I have a degree in. And then I couldn't resist, like all of our people in our naturalist group, Tom included, just fall in love with butterflies and plants and mosses and everything. And I just wanted to mention that there's at least 10, 15, maybe 10 people that could give these presentations. And that's what happens when you're in the club, is that we all sort of study together. We go on field trips, both informal and formal. And so if you became part of the group and joined our hiking trips, as well as help teach our workshops, like we have about 10 people who actually teach the moss and lichen workshops. Gary and I do the lecture, and then all of us do the field trips. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, I digress. So as I say, let's move on to some practical theory first. So I sent a link to a video, which told you about the 3 kinds of rocks. So I would defer to that link for you to go through these 3 kinds of rocks, but I'm going to go through it quickly. I've been surprised that a lot of people don't know what the 3 basic types of rocks are. So I often tell them real simply, if you start with magma coming from the inside of the earth, the molten crust, and you get this pool of magma here, 2 things can happen to it. It can find a crack all in the rocks above it and make it to the surface. And that's called volcanic igneous rock. And that cooled really quickly. No crystals visible. But if this pool of magma, let's offset it and just set it over here for a second. This pool now is cooling slowly as this mountain is eroding down. As it erodes down, the pressure is released. And as pressure is released, heat is released. And this cools slowly. So you get what's called plutonic igneous rock. And that's your granite. This is like your basalt. This is granite. And you can see crystals because it had time to form. The atoms had time to arrange themselves into crystals, and crystals make up rocks. Now, if we have a mountain, we just formed a mountain out of this magma, this volcanic rock, and we have rainfall and freezing and thawing, and little pieces of rock float down with the river and the rain and form into lakes and rivers and ocean, and pile up sediment. And then that sediment gets more and more sediment piled on top of it, more and more, till you have compaction and sedimentation, and you get sedimentary rocks like this. Okay, so we have igneous and sedimentary. Now, if any of these rocks are buried, but not enough to form magma, then they are formed into like a plastic, and the goo kind of rearranges, the atoms rearrange themselves, and the structure rearranges themselves, and that's metamorphic rock. So it's that simple. It's just either volcanic igneous, plutonic igneous, sediment, metamorphic, boom, boom, boom. And just to show you where they are, down here we have the basalt in the Columbia River Basin, east of the mountains, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We have a slightly more lighter colored rock with white spots called andesite. And that makes up almost all of our volcanic rocks. If you go up to any of the volcanoes, you can go up there, hike for 100 paces with your eyes closed, reach down, and you've got andesite. Anyway, that's an exaggeration, but it's mostly true. And plutonic, where's plutonic? Well, remember I said that it formed slowly as the top eroded away. So here's the batholith. All this stuff is being eroded away until finally it peeks through. And here we have a batholith sticking up. And I can't see the top. Why can't I see the top? Anyway, so this mountain, a lot of the mountains in the Cascades are exposed batholiths, which were the pits, the bathtub for the magma that was the source of the magma for the volcanoes. But if it didn't make it to the surface, it cooled slowly and eventually eroded its way to the surface, and you have these batholiths. It's really cool. Sedimentary rocks, well, you have fine-grained shales, sandstones, and conglomerate, and geologists are simple folks. We just name things based on the size of the rock pieces, the bits of eroded rock. So clays all the way up to silt, sand, gravel, and boulder size. One little side note, this is shale. Tell me how you know that that's shale and not basalt. I remember I went up and asked my professor, and I whispered it to him because I was so embarrassed. I said, I can't tell oftentimes the difference between shale and basalt. And he said, yeah, it's one of the scariest things for professors is when someone brings that up there and they don't tell you where it was from. So anyway, it can be tricky. Sediment, obviously, you know, sediment forms these beds, and they can be either straight line, or if there's geologic forces, compression or otherwise, in all kinds of folds. Metamorphic, remember I said heat and pressure, it's buried, but it doesn't form magma. It could be any kind of rock, but it changes. How does it change? Well, here's some shale. The more heat, more time, the more pressure, you get bigger and bigger grains. And then geologists just make cutoffs and they give it different names: phyllite, schist, gneiss. So it's just time and pressure. So there's no mystery. It's trying to remember the damn names that will be the hard part. There's the schematic again. Okay, the other theory is plate tectonics, which I'm not going to spend much time on. But inside the earth, obviously, it's hot, it's molten, the mantle is. And then as you get toward the surface, it starts to harden, but it's kind of a gooey plastic here. But then you have a crust, which is hard. But the crust can either be on the continent, which is thick, or in the ocean, which the plate is thin. The thin plate is much more dense. It's made out of basalt. The continent is much thicker, but it's lighter. And it's made mostly out of things like granite, light rock. So it's buoy. It's kind of almost floats on this rigid mantle. On the buoy upper mantle, buoy plastic. And these crusts are broken into plates. That's important. Here's our plate right here. Here we are, Washington. And we have a mid-Atlantic ridge right here. Okay? And our plate moves this way. And this is our sort of near shore Pacific plate. Here's a ridge, because the plates are splitting apart here. They're splitting apart here. I say that because I'm going to make reference to it later. Now they move, as I say, it's the crusts are splitting here, and this crust is moving this way, this is moving this way. We have a dividing plate here that's spreading, and the North American plate's this way. This other plate is this way. That's why we have our subduction. That's why we have the cascades. Okay, and I think you've all seen this, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but we have the ocean plate diving under the continental plate because the continental plate is lighter. It's like a cork floating on water. This ocean plate is really heavy. So when they come and they collide into each other, the ocean plate dives under and this floats on top. And this is that divergent plate I was talking about where they spread. So the plates are moving this way. And our continent, North America, is moving this way. And we have also a divergent up here. I'll show you in a second. So here, right off our coast, here's Seattle. Right off our coast, we have a spreading plate, just like the mid-Atlantic plate. So this plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, is diving under the continental, the big, thick, lightweight continent, and creating the cascades because it melts with temperature and pressure. You know all about that now. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the geologic history just really quickly. The time frame I'm going to be talking about is basically the time of the dinosaurs, called Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And you've all heard those terms. And I'm going to talk also about a time right after dinosaurs disappeared. So that's all I'm going to say right now. Okay, so a long time ago, many, many millions of years ago, the beach used to be right here. Here's Washington, here's Idaho, right here, the dividing line. Used to call it Rodinia, and now we call it North America. And so this is where the beach was, and there was no one around to enjoy the beach. And this was all ocean. So what we're standing on right now is stuff that came in later. By come in, well, let's talk about first of all, there was a lot of erosion. So we had a lot of sediment forming. So that was one thing that happened. But mainly what we had is these, remember I said that the ocean plate dives under the continental plate, okay? And that's been happening a long time. And it's just like a conveyor belt. So anything on the ocean, like Japan, like Hawaiian Islands, they'd eventually come and bump into North America. And they bump into it. I mean, they bump into it and they stay. They don't go sailing off somewhere else. And so they form new land. And some of these were continent-sized landforms, okay? So, and when they come in, it's not pretty. I mean, they take all that sediment that I mentioned a minute ago and they scrunch it up. And then what happens is, see, here's the conveyor belt ahead of that land. Now it's behind because it's scrunched in, it's docked, we call it. And now the ocean plate breaks and it starts subducting again under the continent. So it happened, this new land just keeps coming and keeps coming until we eventually formed Washington. So here's the incoming terrain. Here's the older terrain. It slammed into it in all kinds of chaos. We have normal faults. We have melting, forming of volcanoes. We have more sedimentary deposits. So it was really a tumultuous time, okay? So here's the first one, and it occurred right about midway into the dinosaur time. And then we had another one come in. It's like these continents just keep coming in. So you get the picture. I don't want to dwell on it. But if you take a cut, like a cut through a cake, you can see it. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. Here's the third one. Here's the Olympics. It's not, I mean, obviously the mountain isn't over the Olympics. It's a schematic. So these are the successful accreted terrains, they call it. So they came in and they docked. So this is the old, what they call a craton, which is the old North America. And this is all this new stuff. Now, this new stuff, you say, well, where is it? We don't really see it. Well, that's because it was there a long time. And we've had the Cascades formed since then. We've had the Columbia basalts cover up most of this. So really the only place you can view parts of it is up in the North Cascades, well, the Olympics too. Okay. And that's why Tom and I are going to the Olympics this weekend, because
we're going to the Okanagan.
We're going to the Okanagan, right? And so we're going to see some of this ancient terrain. I mean, there's been a lot of things happening to it. There's been volcanic intrusions up through it. There's been sediment. There's been grabens. There's been normal faults. This whole land has been stretching. It's been, this side's going this way. This side's been going through this way. And then the old, so anyway, there's many stories up there. And Tom and I are going to go up there and look for birds, but we're going to also try to figure out the geology. So I have a whole box of books trying to figure this out. I know a little bit of it, not the details. Okay, enough of that. So now a lot of stuff happened since then. So well after the dinosaurs disappeared, a mere 17 million years ago, we had the Columbia basalts form. So here's the Cascades, and you all know that we have all this lava here. And it's just amazing how much lava formed here. And most of it actually occurred about 16 million years ago, but it still started oozing out up till about 6 million years ago when it stopped. But most of it happened 16, 17 million years ago. And then we had, after that, and pretty recent, but you know, from 16,000 years ago to 2.6 billion years ago, we had a lot of ice ages. And we had the ice age floods, which came through and changed this whole landscape, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'm just summarizing it for now. And then we had the Cascades form. And this is what we have, sort of a LiDAR representation. So if you strip all the trees away, what do you have? And the water. Here we have our Puget Sound. Here we have the Olympics, the Cascades, and we have the Columbia basalt area. And this is the Northeast area. So now what I'm leading to is this and the next slide, in that this is sort of like a chart. You can say this is a simple version of understanding the geology of Washington. So here is a Columbia Basin, the Okanagan. This is the Columbia Basin where there's basalts and we have the flood basalt and the floods. Here's the Okanagan Highlands, which are a real mess. North Cascades, which are partly eroded away, much more than the South Cascades. Puget Lowland, which had the Ice Age, and the coastal range, which we'll talk about in a second. Oh, actually, I'm going to show you that map later. Forgot, sorry. What we're going to talk about now really quickly is run through just some fun things about the different areas of Washington, like the Olympics. So how did the Olympics form? Well, just after the dinosaurs disappeared, the ocean plate stopped moving. And then we had down in Oregon area, we had huge amount of basalt flooding out into the ocean, okay? And then the ocean plate decided to move again. And so all hell broke loose. We had all the sediment that had formed from the continent, okay? And formed all these layers. And then the basalt came through. And then the ocean plate decided to start moving again. So all this sediment started getting moved up, but the basalt was there. So it started getting shoved eastward. And what happened is this stuff, the sediment started turning on end. And we had just a little bit, a sliver of the basalt that well, no, let's go through this in a minute. It formed like a horseshoe around the entire Olympics, which I'll show you a map in a minute. But a lot of the Olympics is the sediment that was formed, that was shed off the land at the time that the ocean plate stopped moving. It's just fascinating. Anyway, so here we are at the coast, and here's the sediment up on end, just to show you how it was pushed upward. And you'll see this if you go to the coast. So here's that sedimentary rock, and here's that volcanic rock. The sedimentary rock was pushed up and through because it was much lighter. So it pushed up through the basalt. And so you have the ring of basalt around the Olympics. So like this, here's the Olympic Mountains, here's the Pacific Ocean, and here's the sediment, which constitute most of the mountain, and then the basalt rimming it. And so here's a map, a geology map from the air, an aerial view. Here's the basalt forming a horseshoe around the Olympics, and this is all sediment. So that's the origin of the Olympics. So let's do a quick thing, a quick story, the Cascades. So as I said, the ocean plate started subducting again. So we started having the Olympics start forming. And around 50 million years ago, actually more like 37, 40 million years ago, it started flooding out basalts in this area, okay? So 37 to about 14 million years ago, we had huge floods of basalt. I mean, it's like what's happening today, but magnify it by say 10. That's how much flooded basalt you had in the area. And then all of a sudden, the eruption stopped for about 12 million years. Okay, and then the high Cascades. So we have West Cascades existing in our Cascades now. And then we have the high Cascades when the volcanoes started erupting ago. So the volcanoes we have today that you see are the new West high Cascades, from about 3 million years ago. But we still have a lot of the material from the West Cascades. So I point that out because when you look at an aerial view, you can see these are all what came out. These are the West Cascades, and here's the high Cascades. So we call them West, but much more volcanic material came out at that time. So here's our five volcanoes, and they're part of the West Cascades. But these are the batholiths that we were talking about. Remember, they are that remaining bathtub of lava that cooled slowly, that never made it to the surface to become volcanic or quick. And in fact, the West Cascades and the high Cascades are prevalent all along the coast, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Okay. So here is part of the high Cascades. It's the foundation. This is the Tatoosh. And it formed the foundation for Mount Rainier, but it's way older, millions of years older than Mount Rainier, which is part of the high Cascades, which started like 3 million years ago. So we see a tremendous difference between the North Cascades and South Cascades. So right about Snoqualmie Pass, it's like a pivot point. So we had more uplift in the north than we did in the south. So when you have more uplift, you have more erosion because water runs faster and just erodes more. So that's why we can see a lot of that old original rock that came in. But in the South Cascades, we have all this volcanic cover. And that's why the North Cascades, I know since a kid, I always thought of the North Cascades as being much more dynamic. And that's the reason, is because there's more uplift in the north. So just, these are, well, I just wanted to mention one thing. A lifespan of a volcano is about 2 million years. So where's how do I know there was more volcanoes forming? Well, the evidence is in the batholiths, because the batholiths, remember, was the pool of magma that never made it to the surface. So these must be where past volcanoes existed. And only the old remaining magma, cooled magma, is evident now. Because you can think of volcanoes as sort of just big piles of rubble, because Mount Rainier is really not very old. And this is the original height of Mount Rainier, and this is the height now. So I think it's about 50,000 years old, and they only last 2 million years. So Mount Rainier is going to be worn down. In fact, when we had the West Cascades, we had really beautiful, we must have been magnificent cascades, but then it was all worn down to the nub. And you could bike ride from Seattle to Spokane really easily, no mountains to go over, until the eruption started again and we had the high Cascades. So it's kind of just fun to realize that the high Cascades are built on the foundation created by the West Cascades, Western Cascades. I think this is Nisqually batholith. I can't read the top, but it just shows that we have a lot of batholiths exposed, and then they're eroded down, and so they form these mountains. So these are the old pooled magma that cooled. I'm not going to talk about this, just shows the frequency over the years of the eruptions from various volcanoes. You can go back, these will be online. I do want to talk about the Columbia River basalts and the flooding that happened afterwards. So I'm going to talk about the origin of this. So we had all these flood basalts. They started here, and then they flowed all the way down till they met the Columbia, until they met the ocean. Okay. And here it is. This is the extent of the basalt flows here. And they mostly occurred about 17 million years ago. But the thing that's phenomenal is right about here, where you have maximum depth, they're 2.5 miles thick. And that's one of the reasons we can't study some of the historical geology in this area, because it's covered up. So a lot of Washington is all this stuff that came in. We can't understand the sequence and the rocks and what happened, because Cascades formed, because the Columbia basalts formed. Okay. So this just shows the basalts of the Columbia basalts, and there's about 300 layers, 2.5 miles thick. And here's how they formed. We had huge fissures, cracks in the earth, and those formed here. These red lines show you where some of these things were really long, a couple miles long. And it just had huge amount of lava coming out of them. And they traveled very fast all the way to the Pacific in about 2 to 4 days. You could not outrun these things. It must have been just amazing. As they come out, they're about 18 to 30 miles per hour. And then all the way to the ocean, they average 3 to 9 miles an hour. And that's 2.5 miles thick, so about 300 those things over that extent of time. Oh, do remember though that between each lava flow might be a couple 100,000 years. So you had a lot of soil vegetation forming until the next one. Now, how come these formed? Well, it formed from this way deep in the earth, these plumes came up and they fed these fractures. And this is an enormous amount of lava. So they fed those fractures and fissures until it formed all the Columbia basalts. And it's just like what's under Hawaii right now. There's a hot spot and the crust moves. You can see the movement of the crust. This hot spot stays put and it forms all these individual islands, and until they erode down and they disappear. Remember, you think of these as piles of rubble and they disappear and new ones are forming. So now we think that this hot spot with the crust moving this way, that hot spot has stayed put and it's now under Yellowstone theory. So, well, I hope you're still sticking with me here. Now let's talk about glaciation. So what we have is we have a Puget lowland. The lowland that we're now standing on, living in, was not formed by the glaciers. That was this basin subsiding. It's just a worldwide phenomena that when you have subsidence of the ocean crust and you have a mountain arc here, these 4 arc basins form, and that's what we have here. Okay. Here, this is the Olympics with the sediment and the basalt. But this is just a classic 4 arc basin. Okay, then the glaciers came down, as you know, and they covered Seattle. And this is the depth. These are in feet. So here's Seattle. We're under about 3,000 feet of ice. And here's the ice, just to show you a schematic from the side. Here's Seattle here. And this is Puget Sound that was gouged out in large part by the glaciers and left us this beautiful Puget Sound and left us a lot of debris. And one of the things that left us is one of these things called drumlins, which is a erosional depositional landform. And why am I mentioning that? Because this is all these drumlins. This is southern Puget Sound that are formed in our area. And this is Seattle. And look at all the drumlins that are formed in Seattle. So this is why we have a hard time traveling from east to west and west to east, but have an easy time traveling north and south. It's because of those landforms, the drumlins. In fact, there's First Hill. These are drumlins. Capitol Hill, First Hill, Queen Anne, etc. Which brings us back to the Channel Scablands. So what happened after the basalts formed, much later, of course, is we had the ice coming down and they blocked off this glacial Lake Missoula. I can't remember the length of glacial lake. I think it's like 200 miles long, huge amount of water. And then over time, different theories that maybe the water would get so deep it would lift up the ice and then just break it up. And then it would break through and all this lake would flood out over the Columbia basalts and go down into the Columbia River and out to the ocean. And these huge, 65 miles an hour, about 5 times the width of Niagara, 10 times the flow of all the world's rivers combined. And you can imagine this is not distilled water. This is water that is carrying rubble and sand and boulders. So there's tremendous amount of erosion. And this is the paths it took. And then finally made it out to the ocean. It left these huge scablands as a result. And you've seen it if you've been over there. It forms these huge box-shaped canyons. This is a Grand Coulee. This is another one, huge amount of scouring. One of the things that help is we have the basalt, and it has cracks, columns, because of the way it cools from the bottom, and just by the way things, not just basalt, the way things cools, they form a hexagonal, and that forms fractures. Where's my pointer? Up and down, but it's also fractured sideways. So when this tremendous water came down, it had all these blocks. It just plucked them out of the side and makes these block-like canyon. That's why they're so up and down. And it also had these huge potholes that were formed by whirlpools you can stand in. And also these current ripples. They had a long time figuring out because these things are huge, but they're the same things that you would find on a beach. If you go current ripples, you've seen these when they're really small, but these are huge in Eastern Washington. So can I read a geology map? And this, you saw this before, these different areas. And these different areas, South Cascades, North Cascades, Columbia Basalt, they are evident when you look at a geology map. Now, this is your chart that I did not create, obviously, but it is color coded. And so you can tell via these colors what is happening in Washington. Here is the Columbia River basalts. This is the basalt, the brown color. This is loose sediment that eroded down by rivers to expose the Columbia River basalt. This is just a color for loose sediment. Here's the brown for volcanic, just like this. This is the Olympics, and here's sediment. And this is sediment as well. This is violet for metamorphic. I just put the letters in to show you. So there's metamorphic, metamorphic. This, you can see, is just a melange of colors and complex, because this is where it's still exposed. And a lot of this has not been covered up yet. And that's what Tom and I are going to go up and explore. Anyway, so it's fun to know this general geology map. But now, maybe that's not enough. Maybe you want to explore a little, go for a hike right here in this area. So what can you do? So you take this area and you go to this website, which you can go to, and you can zero in on this area right here. And if I clicked on this, this is what would happen. It would be outlined and it would tell me what the geologic unit was and a description of what's going on there. So you can really zoom in on this. This is from Washington State. So I put that, I sent it to you actually. And just some favorite books. This is my rock and mineral identification. I don't know if it's in print. I picked it up at a secondhand bookstore. I just love it. And these are books, these are my four favorite books for information on geology as you drive here or as you're out hiking, both here and here. And this one is a little bit of both. So this one is by far the best for hikes. If you look through it, it'll describe selected hikes and it'll just wonderfully describe the story of what's going on around you. It's really a great book. I sent you this already. These are different links. This is really good here. This is geotourism. It'll tell you for the various regions that we just talked about, what's going on there. It'll talk about the Okanagan. It'll talk about the Columbia River basalts in very general, young naturalist terms. Here's the Washington geology maps. You can go on there and experiment with it. This is the 3 types of rocks, and a really good video. And this one, continental drift, 240 million years ago to 250 million years in the future, with wonderful symphony music played along for you to enjoy while you watch this. And it's just no talking. It just shows the different plates moving around, bumping into each other, spreading apart, rifting, coming together. It's really a fun video. And this one, this guy is a folk hero of many of us in the naturalist group and many, many more. He has a YouTube site and he has lectures, general lectures about different areas of Washington. He talks about the various land that came, as I described, it came in and docked in. He describes that. Unfortunately, it's 24 lectures and about 40 hours of lecturing. But he also has a 101 class, which you can watch for free. So it's really a nice thing. And also, I just wanted to mention that we have just started sort of a subgroup within our naturalist study group, which hopefully you'll join, where we're going to be studying geology, sort of a geology subgroup. And so we're going to be adding that as one additional major element, along with plants and birds and butterflies, to our hikes. And some of them will be, especially later in the summer when the birds and especially the plants have sort of burn up, we'll concentrate on geology. Okay, that's pretty much it. me. Let's see.
Thank you, Stuart.
You're welcome.
Andrew's laying on the ground being sedimentary rock right now. or shale, I'm not sure. Before we wrap up for the night, does anyone have any questions?
I think we covered so much, they might be in shell shock.
Or else they got so excited about the butterflies that they left. They're outside catching butterflies.
Right.
As long as they're looking for angle wings and not angel wings.
Yeah, oh, I love, those are my favorites just because they're so odd, but they'll always be angel wings to me instead of angle wings. Anyway, yeah, using that butterfly chart, you can start right away. You know, I hardly ever refer to the book because I'm just perfectly happy knowing these subgroups. So, same with the geology. You can just stay general geology and go to Nick's YouTube websites, and he'll just, sometimes they're only like 2 minutes, sometimes they're 10 minutes, and they'll tell you fascinating things about the Olympics and Columbia basalts and all kinds of stuff. How everyone keeps track of their finds. I don't know that either.
Well, I think for Sarah's question, some people keep track of birds on with Merlin and the Cornell lab, the All About Birds. I'm not a list keeper. I'm getting old enough now so that I keep seeing the same thing, but it's new every time I see it. So if I
You know,
don't,
so Donna, a couple of people in our group are real photographers, and they sort of keep notes via photography, and then they go home and they organize it. I do that too. I put them into organized form so I can study them at home. I don't take notes very much.
some people use the plant list from the Native Plant Society to write things down.
Yeah.
They can keep track in Excel.
I'm completely dependent on that plant list, and I keep a file, and I write all over those plant lists. I keep notes, just massive notes on these plant lists. And then I use the same one each year. And then I send that out to participants on the website, not with my notes, but we send out that plant list and we organize it by plant family. A lot of ways to keep notes, photos, things like that.
All right, well, I think that wraps it up for tonight. Thanks everybody so much for coming, and we'll see you for field trip round 3 in the next month.
Good.
Thank you.